Beijing, the Chinese government on Monday blamed the U.S. side for the deterioration of trade talks, while U.S. President Donald Trump himself admits in an interview that he's pressing China to accept less than a 50-50 deal. Why would Beijing be expected to agree to such a deal? And in Australia, the incumbent coalition wins a stunning re-election. Is there any hope that Australia will warm its chilly relations with China, its largest trading partner? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. China on Monday laid blame squarely on the American side for the collapse of trade talks between the world's two largest economies. Specifically, the U.S. has applied, quote, extreme pressure in pursuit of, quote, unreasonable demands, said a spokesperson for the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The spokesman added that the U.S. wants to confuse public opinion and shift the blame onto others. The statement came on the heels of an interview broadcast Sunday night in which U.S. President Donald Trump reiterated his claim that China had backed out of a, quote, very strong deal. During the interview, he also seemed to express glee with his claim that the new tariffs on Chinese goods have, quote, totally killed China, driving companies to relocate from China to Vietnam and other countries in Asia. Is China's loss necessarily America's gain? What would it take to return the two sides to the negotiating table? Joining me for this discussion are joining us online from Hong Kong, Ross Feingold, an Asian political risk analyst, and in the Beijing studio, Zhao, a research fellow with the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. First, for the matter of exactly where the blame lies on the interruption or the disruption of the trade talks, let's first take a look at what the spokesperson Lu Kang said in a most recent presser.
I don't know what agreement the U.S. side is talking about. They may have thought they had an agreement on some of their excessive demands, but it's definitely not an agreement that the Chinese side agreed to. The fundamental reason for the failure to reach an agreement in the 11 rounds of China-U.S. economic and trade consultations is that the U.S. side is trying to realize unreasonable demands for its interests through extreme pressure.
So, Zhao, here in the studio, let me start with you. When you haven't signed an agreement, should you be blamed for breaking a deal?
Of course not. And I think China's side has made it very clear that we're still in this process, which has been going on for 11 rounds. And also, it's a very tough negotiation. The Trump administration, particularly Trump himself, probably got the wrong idea from his advisors and top negotiators that China has agreed to some this and that, and he believed that it's very close to a deal. I think Mnuchin said, the deal has already finished, very close to finish 90 to 95%. And they believe just as long as we have a deal on the rest, 5 to 10%, then the deal is done. However, when we're getting closer to the final items on the table, I think the Americans adding more and more items and trying to pressure China to accept unreasonable articles in that deal. And that actually break the deal, not the Chinese side, as they said, backtracked.
And it's also because I was covering, for instance, the Iran nuclear deal very closely, and it has always been the case throughout the years of negotiation that all sides, basically the sides of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council under the coordination of the European Union, their position has always been when not everything is agreed. So if you haven't agreed on every single detail, then nothing is agreed to.
Until you sign it.
Until you sign it, so nothing is set in stone. But why does President Trump then say there was a very strong agreement, there was a very strong deal then?
I think he's really eager to get this deal done as quickly as possible because the election is coming up and he wants to show that he has get a very big deal and also a political victory for him. However, at this point, because we're getting to the deep waters and the difficult part, he has no patience to wait for the end of the deal. Therefore, when there's some kind of problem during this exchange of text, he has lost patience and lost the ability to continue to control the process of the deal. So I think that's why he made the mistake of trying to add more tariffs and basically trying to pressure China more.
Let me get to that interview he gave, which was aired on Sunday, and he did the interview on Fox, and he said he told Chinese President Xi Jinping before the most recent round of talks that any deal could not be 50-50 between the two sides and had to be more in favor of the U.S. because of past trade practices by China. Mr. Feingold, what do you think the U.S. president is trying to do by telling this on air, telling it to the world that the U.S. has been trying to press China to accept an unequal treaty? Should anybody be expected to accept this kind of deal?
Well, as you mentioned, we're going into an election season in the United States. The president is giving interviews to encourage support from the voters who voted for him last time. And it's a difficult negotiation. So the fact that President Trump would say in an interview that he wants to get a better deal or a deal that's better for the United States, I don't think that should surprise any observer that this is how he would portray the deal. Ultimately, China will only sign a deal that China thinks is fair for China, and the United States thinks is fair for the United States.
But he said he told the Chinese president not to expect a 50-50 deal. So either he lied that he didn't tell the Chinese president this, or he was, just really expected the Chinese to accept an unfair deal.
But again, this is President Trump's style when he negotiates. I think we could look by analogy to some of the other trade negotiations that have occurred during his presidency with large trading partners such as South Korea or Canada and Mexico. These were very difficult negotiations. Sometimes the leadership from those other countries were very angry at President Trump. Sometimes President Trump was angry at them, but it's all part of the process, and it's a difficult process.
So basically you're saying in order to win a deal, you can say whatever, you can do whatever?
Well, I don't think President Trump would phrase it that way. It's just part of
I'm asking you, Mr. Feingold.
Well, I wouldn't phrase it that way myself either. I would say it's just part of being a very tough negotiator, and that's one thing that Donald Trump is known for throughout his business career.
All right. Zhao here in the studio, how do you think this kind of, if he really told Chinese President Xi Jinping this, how do you think this would go down with the Chinese leadership?
No, I don't think he has ever told President Xi through a phone call or any other means. I think he can continue and always claim that Mexico will pay for the wall. But I think American people understand that the Americans are paying for the wall. And also he talked about Chinese are paying for the tariff. And we all know 90% of the tariff are paid by importers of the U.S. and the consumers in the U.S. So I think he can continue to have these false claims all around and trying to gain political scores. But at the end of the day, it's not true.
But that's unthinkable that in order to gain political scores, you can just go on national TV and say things which are either unfounded or untrue or misleading in any way to the people who are going to decide whether to re-elect you or not.
Because his calculation is that he cannot, he can play this both ways, right? On the one hand, if there's no deal, he can say, I show toughness. And on the other hand, if there is really a deal, he can always say, oh, I said I'm going to get an unequal deal now, and I'm winning. And by Chinese surrendering to my request.
And he also talked about if this is the same style, maybe we should stop the conversation right here, trying to dissect what he said. But he did go on in that interview and talk about that China would eventually make a deal with the U.S. because they are getting killed with the tariffs. China is getting totally killed, and this is basically quite the opposite of the economic performance of China. In the first quarter of this year, Chinese economy grew by 6.4%. That's higher than the expected 6.3%. So, Mr. Feingold, let me try to ask you again, what could President Trump possibly mean by China getting totally killed?
Well, of course, again, this goes back to his negotiating style, but it's interesting because not only did China have...
You can't just say whatever, right, in national TV. You need to have some evidence to back up what you say.
Well, we know that the tariffs are going to hurt whether it's U.S. consumers or Chinese exporters, and if exports to the U.S. Go down in the coming weeks or months, if the tariffs are in effect, Of course, that will have some impact on Chinese exporters. But look, China is going to look for other ways to make up for that, whether it's growing the domestic market or additional trade.
But the thing is, he's saying China is
Asia.
getting totally killed. That's just not the case. And he was also talking about China. He also talking about companies relocating from China to Vietnam and to other countries in Asia. And this is actually quite funny because we were checking out this website on Yahoo, which carried this story, and there were a lot of comments at the bottom of that story, and some of them actually pointed right out. For instance, this person by the name of Henry says, so Trump thinks that companies moving from China to other foreign country is a win, and he's getting a lot of thumbs up for that answer. And then another person said, Trump took the step after China soured the negotiations by seeking major changes to a deal that U.S. officials said had been largely agreed. Unfortunately, at this point in history, China's government is more trustworthy than our own. And then another netizen by the name of American Patriot says companies will stay in foreign countries as long as wages are lower there. Looks like U.S. wages would have to drop about 80%. Good luck with that. So, Ms. Feingold, exactly why are companies relocating out of China to other Asian countries a win for the United States?
Well, if it's going to eliminate or reduce the trade deficit that China has with the United States, then President Trump is going to claim it's a victory. Are companies really going to do that? It's something that a lot of people speculate on, but we all know that it takes time. It takes a lot of money to relocate factories. But it's a good talking point for President Trump. Whether it will actually come to pass, will it come to fruition that so many factories move out of China? Again, it's a little early to say, but for President Trump, it's a good talking point because you could say, I've imposed tariffs, and now it's harder to export from China. And again, a lot of his supporters in the United States will believe him.
But again, if you look from a third-party angle, all of this sounds very ridiculous, right? I mean, Zhao, all of these factories that are moving out of China are not going back to the United States.
I think President Trump is probably under some influence. He's really looking at the stock market as an ultimate indicator of economic performance.
Did any of his advisors explain to him that the Chinese stock market is not the barometer of the Chinese economic performance?
It is, to some extent, right? Also, just like American stock market, it's an indicator of economy, but not the whole story. But I doubt, Larry Kudlow can persuade President Trump to the real economic principle. And secondly, I think a lot of the hotliners in his administration is trying to persuade him to decouple with Chinese economy. Therefore, anything that help to relocate industries out of China is a good thing for America.
Whether or not it goes back to the United States.
Whether or not going back to the but remember Trump's campaign saying that relocating those industries back to the U.S. is a win for him. Now he's changing his story. I don't think it's going to settle in well with his voters.
So how are we going to understand what President Trump says in these interviews? Because these several points that I tried to understand, they don't seem to add up for me.
I think every word is it doesn't matter. I think he's just facing his voters and trying to connect with them and trying to say that he's winning and letting those people be patient. Because a lot of people are hurting, farmers, consumers, and he's trying to calm them down and say, I'm winning, and just wait for the Chinese to come back to the negotiation table.
What's the difference between that and misleading or even cheating?
Well, he's used all possible tactics, including blackmail against China. So, I mean, there's nothing too low for him at this point.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Many thanks to my two guests from Hong Kong, Ross Feingold, an Asian political risk analyst, and in our Beijing studio, Zhao, a research fellow with the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. You have been watching The Point with me, Liu Xin. We'll take a short break. And when we come back, a surprise re-election in Australia does not offer much optimism for improved relations with China, or does it?